Inside Outlook is proudly supported by the Evans School of Public Affairs at the University of Washington, leading the field in public policy and management education, research and service for more than 50 years.
Every day, trains carrying up to 3 million gallons of highly flammable oil, in addition to trains hauling millions of tons of coal, run under downtown Seattle through this 105-year-old tunnel behind me. These trains depart from Wyoming and North Dakota and are en route to oil refineries in Anacortes and Cherry Point. With proposals on the table to expand refining operations in the state and to build the Gateway Pacific Coal Export Terminal in Cherry Point, the traffic of these trains is only set to increase throughout Puget Sound. What is the impact of the growing coal and oil industry on Washington State and our economy? How should it be regulated, and how will it influence our efforts in combating global climate change? Today on Inside Outlook, we tackle these questions and more. Stay tuned. Down in Soto, and increasingly I'm stopped at traffic with these big Freightliners that are coming through that carry up to 3 million gallons of Bakken crude oil from North Dakota. They're traveling through the region that quite literally go under downtown Seattle en route to Anacortes and Cherry Point. With big markets in Asia and booming coal and oil industry in Wyoming and North Dakota in search of ports to export, the Northwest is poised to experience major growth in fossil fuel industries. Just how big of a change in the industry are we witnessing at this current moment?
The oil industry and natural gas industry in the United States has experienced a real renaissance in the past decade as far as production of oil and gas in the United States, mostly from the advancement of new technologies, which is allowing the tight shale formations to be produced. And what we're talking about today is the North Dakota Bakken formation. And all of these areas are having tremendous growth to be able to produce these shales that historically they've known, they've been there forever, but the ability to produce them has only been recently brought to light.
And this is relatively new. You know, the first oil by rail shipments are less than 2 years old.
It's slightly longer than 2 years old. The first ones arrived in, I think, the fall of 2012, and that's when we began seeing the initial stages of what is poised to become a sea change in the way that we think about oil in this region, certainly, and it's true nationally as well. So we've really seen a dramatic scale up. It's not something I would argue that we have a lot of experience dealing with, and I think recent events have shown that we're not well prepared to deal with the ramifications of that, particularly when it comes to the risk of catastrophic combustion. We've seen, I think, 4 explosions in the last 3 weeks alone. So this industry is still very much in its infancy. It's not a mature industry, and it's something that poses real risks for communities, including those in Soto, like near your office, but also for rural regions as well.
When you say that you're seeing a sea change that is about to come, I mean, what can we anticipate?
If you think about the sliver of coast between British Columbia and Oregon, so maybe Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and Coos Bay, Oregon, you think about all of the oil, coal, and gas projects planned for that region, that little sliver of coast, that northwest coast, that adds up to roughly the carbon equivalent of about 5 Keystone XL pipelines, where we go from a region that has historically been connected more to clean energy and innovation, and we very well could turn a new page where we become an industry or region that is embedded in coal, oil, and gas.
Well, one of the things that we've been working with community leaders, businesses, tribes, labor unions, other partners, is helping to just better understand, okay, there are economic benefits from each of these proposals, there's certain job creation, but there's also a lot of conflicts. There's conflicts in terms of the communities. If you want to talk jobs, you need to know how to subtract.
Explain that a little bit further.
Well, so say we're talking with businesses, we're talking with communities who are looking at the issues from the standpoint of what are the impacts on our community. Most importantly, if there's a public cost, such as the cost of putting in an overpass over that track, they want to ensure that the project proponents are going to be picking up a fair share and ensure that we have a rational discussion about what all of this looks like, including the carbon impacts, before we just make a whole bunch of piecemeal decisions which can put communities at risk.
Frank, is there a bigger strategy as opposed to these piecemeal decisions? I mean, is there a strategy within the industry working with the state?
We have 5 refineries here in the state of Washington, and they are located between Tacoma and the Canadian border. And those 5 refineries have been here since the 1950s, but they're not growing. You know, they've got a set capacity, and what you're seeing here is with the increase in domestic production and the decline in production from Alaska North Slope, this is just replacing that.
Is that your understanding, Eric, that this is just a replacement of other?
No, absolutely not. So if we think about the entire picture of oil by rail scheduled for delivery to the Northwest, if we look at all the actual permits in place, from the Vancouver, Washington, to the Grace Harbor projects where there are 3, to the Northwest refineries, and you add up all of the oil scheduled for delivery to those sites, based on actual permits on the ground now, that exceeds our refining capacity by like 20 or 30%. We are extracting so much that we don't even have enough places to put it all right now. So this really is something that's completely out of scale with what we have seen in the past.
What's coming into the Washington refineries will go up a small amount. Right now it's about 150,000 barrels a day. It may go up to about 200,000 barrels a day with this expansion because it gives more capacity to that line to be able to bring the crudes to the Northwest. But we're not seeing those projects impact the refining industry here in the state of Washington.
The concern that we see is the cumulative impacts of this rush to get this coal through our ports and through building new ports to get this oil out without any accounting for what are the environmental costs, what are the economic costs, what kind of safety risks are we going to be bearing in our communities, and what are the trade-offs.
What are some of the trade-offs?
There's huge safety risks with both coal and oil, but oil is literally an explosive issue. Just in the last 2 weeks, there have been 3 explosions, several of them involving the so-called newer tank cars, which the rail industry has been saying will be a panacea to solve this problem. This whole new explosion, literally, in oil train traffic is something that we need to have better understanding. We need to have pre-treatment guidelines for what goes into those tank cars. We need to really have a whole set of safety protocols. We need to have better training for our firemen and emergency responders before we allow this to move forward. And at minimum, we obviously need to have a very detailed environmental review.
There has been a lot of concerns, and the incidents that have been mentioned were terrible, and nobody wants those to happen. But there has been a lot of activity at all levels to address some of those concerns. There was concerns about the tank cars that Ross mentioned. Industry in 2011 said, yeah, those aren't really up to safety standards, and voluntarily put in the new cars. And I'll have to say that from the Washington perspective, our 5 refineries have stepped up before any regulations are in place, and are now using the new cars for all deliveries to the refineries. Is the latest schedule on that.
Ahead a little bit here. What's
In the last 3 weeks alone, since Valentine's Day, we've seen 4 of those trains derail and blow up. And it's one thing to hear somebody say a train blew up. That sounds scary. Just Google it. Just go to YouTube, look at the videos, look at a 300-foot tall fireball erupting out of the new safer tank cars, and wonder what that would look like if it happened in an urban area. And I think it's extreme risk. Until we can move it safely, we shouldn't do it. That's what the firefighters of Washington State have said. That's what we're seeing across the nation right now. When we can move it safely, then let's have a conversation about it. Right now, we can't do that.
Russ?
One question I think always has to be asked to industry when they say, oh no, we can do this safely, is who bears the risk? Do you have insurance? Do the oil companies or does the railroad have adequate insurance for the kind of risk that would be incurred if another lac Magentique happened and people were killed, or even for significant property damage? And the answer very clearly from the Insurance companies is no, they're not willing to insure this risk.
Does the industry bear the risk?
The overarching plan that is in place is the Northwest Area Contingency Plan. That's a plan for both onshore and offshore responses. It involves U.S. EPA, U.S. Coast Guard, state of Washington, state of Oregon, state of Idaho. And it's a very comprehensive plan. They've looked at the rail components of it since the increase in the activity in coal and oil transport. Those have been incorporated into the plan. And so the plan is in place. The emergency response folks are part of that. And it handles not only oil and coal incidents, but also any hazardous release or response that would take place.
On a state level, I mean, how much voice do we have on the future of the development of this industry in the state?
We have almost entirely control over it. We get to make the decision about whether we build those facilities, and if building them means that we will introduce into this state, 5 to 10 additional oil trains per day, loaded, that is. And then on top of that, then we have the question of existing service to the Puget Sound refineries. Again, those are governed by local land use permits and local air quality permits. There are things we can do to have control over the receiving sites. So we have 5 refineries on Puget Sound. 4 of them are big in the North Sound. All of them have marine docks, and all of them now have or are planning to have rail unloading loops. They could simply receive crude oil by train and then put it on a vessel and ship it somewhere else, either to California, abroad. That's, to me, a potentially serious risk that increases even further the risk of oil spills in Puget Sound, in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, around the San Juan Islands, and so on. And I think it's something that we haven't seen debated properly.
We all use gasoline, we all use jet fuel in our transportation. So as these new domestic sources are coming on, you're seeing increased pressure downward on the cost of crude, which is the major cost component of providing the fuels. And you're seeing that today. We're seeing that we're backing out foreign imports from sources that aren't friendly to us. We are seeing the price of crude oil being lowered because of this increased supply. And so who's benefiting with that economic activity? It's all of us.
Even if that oil is eventually exported abroad, I mean, how much of that benefit?
Well, in the United States, you cannot export crude oil.
Canadian crude oil is not subject to the U.S. export ban because it's not U.S. domestic crude. If you have a port terminal site like Vancouver, Washington, that is 100+ miles from any refinery, and you're taking the stuff, loading it onto an ocean-going vessel, and sending it out the mouth of the Columbia, maybe in the near term, the project proponent, Tesoro, wants to take it to, or they say they want to take it to California refineries that are already fairly well supplied with oil. But why not just take it to markets abroad? It seems to me that if you look at the aggregate numbers for all of these proposals and look at the types of oil that are intended for them and look at the oil industry lobbying to lift the ban, isn't this really just an export play?
It doesn't make a lot of economic sense to take Canadian crude separately by rail down to Vancouver and then put on another ship and move it to California or to other states. The other component of that is that has to be segregated all the way through the process. So to maintain that segregation all the way through to export is very difficult. So personally, I don't really see that as a real viable option.
Again, the oil industry's representatives are actively lobbying for that in Congress, as well as utilizing existing administrative loopholes to allow Bakken crude and other things with very light minimal treatment to actually be exported. Is this something where we understand the risks and are able as a community to understand what those trade-offs are? And the answer now, again, is clearly no. So that's why we've been pushing very hard to ensure that there's a full analysis of these projects. We need to be stopping, looking, and listening, understanding what the impacts are, understanding what the consequences are, and making rational decisions for our communities. What extra risks is that going to pose? What is that going to mean in Vancouver? What's that going to mean in Spokane? What's that going to mean in the San Juan Islands if there's barge traffic or increased tanker traffic? We don't believe that these projects should move forward But the minimum step is we need to have this full evaluation with all the facts in front of us without people hiding the cards.
So this is the main rail route that runs through Seattle. This rail route is the only way to go north and south through the state. It's owned and operated by BNSF, which is the major carrier in the Pacific Northwest. Right now we're seeing about 2 to 3 coal trains a day, and we're seeing around 2 to 3 oil trains per day. In the future, that could increase dramatically in the case of coal. We could see 16, 18, 20 trains a day heading north through here if we get the coal terminal expansions and new coal terminals. So we've got a huge coal terminal, be the biggest in North America, planned for Whatcom County. It's on a greenfield site, Cherry Point. Another huge coal terminal will be the second biggest in North America. That's planned for Longview, Washington. So what we're really seeing is a complete sea change in the way that this region has ever handled energy and the way that the rail lines have ever dealt with fossil fuels. This is something that's completely new under the sun. We've dealt with small amounts of it in the past, nothing like what the future holds. It used to be when we were thinking about coal, the big safety concerns were coal dust, pollution from the trains themselves, and then of course the impacts of trains crossing at high speeds over where vehicles and pedestrians are walking. Now, with oil trains, it's a completely different story because an oil train, as we've seen 9 times in the last 2 years, an oil train has the propensity to derail and combust. And we're talking about 300-foot-tall fireballs. We're talking about death tolls. One town in Quebec killed 47 people when an oil train derailed in the middle of that town. Every environmental group in the state, bar none, opposes these projects. The environmental concerns run the gamut, from coal mining, oil drilling. The oil is fracked oil from North Dakota. And then, of course, the big one that should be on everyone's mind is climate change. This is coal and oil we don't need to burn. Nobody needs to burn it. Most of it's going to be heading to Asia. It's going to be adding to the consumption and the combustion of fossil fuels that are warming the planet. It's very, very dangerous. And it's really strange that the Northwest, which has been a leader in clean energy, been a leader on environmental issues for many, many years, is now about to become a highway for climate destruction pointed to Asia.
Senator Michael Baumgartner proposed an oil pipeline as opposed to use of trains.
Well, because we are so awash in fossil fuels already, that it is what would happen with an oil pipeline is that we would simply add to the volume of oil scheduled for delivery here that already exceeds our ability to handle it.
Right. Industry ready to grapple with the risks that were just illuminated?
There is a process to look at all these projects from an environmental perspective under the state law, which is SEPA, State Environmental Policy Act. And those have different levels of thresholds. The local ones that Ross was talking about can go through an environmental assessment where they look at the environmental assessment that is done on the project and make a determination whether it needs a full EIS or not. And they will come up with the evaluation. They'll come up with unavoidable risk and identify those. They will come up with mitigation to address those risks and what needs to be done for that project to move forward.
The other irony for the pipeline proposal is that there's, at least from what we've seen, and we follow the industry press on this all the time, there's zero private sector interest in building it for a couple simple reasons. One is people understand the challenge of building that kind of pipeline and the significant expense that would be involved. But second, because the whole Bakken crude phenomenon is very much a boom and is currently going into some bust kind of phenomenons, and there's not any confidence in Wall Street about the long-term viability of that as a huge store of energy for the decades that would be needed to amortize the value of a pipeline. What we'd like to see is Washington devoting the attention to how we can get ourselves gradually off the fossil fuels, reduce our carbon emissions, and create more homegrown energy that we're going to be reaping the benefits from in terms of our economy and jobs, as well as having a more sustainable society.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that we have not discussed really explicitly climate change.
Well, Climate Solutions wouldn't be involved in this fight if we didn't see that the oil and coal issues and our decision whether or not we want to be a gateway for accelerating the extraction of these resources that need to be staying in the ground under any assessment of what the science is telling us about carbon emissions. And if we our state devote significant resources, pay public money to help pay for the infrastructure costs that will be needed to be addressed, the impacts of these kind of massive fossil fuel impacts, that's going to be greatly accelerating our impacts towards global climate change.
Right, how does climate change, how is it spoken about within the industry?
Yeah, we don't question it at all. As I alluded to earlier when I was talking about the big picture in the United States, we're seeing a lot of the coal projects being converted to natural gas, which is lowering your greenhouse gas emissions substantially. We are working on a number of issues right now, and some of the proposals that are out there are infeasible. For instance, the low carbon fuel standard that's being debated right now. There's insufficient quantities of low carbon fuels to be able to comply in the time frame that's proposed for this project, for these proposals. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's going to be very costly to the consumer. And so we need to focus our attention on options to reduce greenhouse gases that are cost effective and won't impact the economy.
What should our audience take away from this?
Let's say the next 2 years. The next 2 years, this state, this region, local communities are going to make decisions that will be with us until we have grandchildren. These are big decisions. We are deciding right now whether we are going to build coal, oil, and gas infrastructure that will enable and encourage us to use ever more fossil fuels, far more than we have in the past, and export far more fossil fuels than we ever have in the past. Or we will make a series of decisions that will transition us away from that in a gradual and orderly fashion toward a cleaner and more renewable and sustainable economy. That's the choice we have right now. We have an outsized role here in the Northwest that most other regions will not have, and that's a decision that we will make in the next probably 2 years. And I think in some ways, the weight of the world hangs on what we decide here.
And on that, we will conclude.
Inside Outlook is made possible by support from the Evans School of Public Affairs at the University of Washington.